The floorboards of the Twin Creek Bank groaned under the weight of a silence so heavy it felt like a shroud. Dust motes illuminated by the slanting afternoon sun danced in the still air, each a tiny glittering world, oblivious to the tension coiling in the room. Colt Maddox stood before the teller's cage, his hat held respectfully in his hands, the brim worn smooth by years of weather and worry. The air smelled of old paper-oiled steel and the faint cloying scent of the teller's bay rum tonic. He was here for the last of it, the inheritance his father had left, a sum that had once seemed vast, but had dwindled like a stream in a drought. It was enough to buy a small plot of land, somewhere far from the ghosts that rode at his heels. Enough for a quiet end. "Just need to withdraw the balance," Mr. Abernathy Colt said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. The teller, a small man with a perpetually nervous twitch in his left eye, nodded, his fingers fumbling with the ledger. "Of course, Mr. Maddox. The full amount. It will just take a moment." That moment was stolen. The front door slammed open, kicked with such force that the glass pane shivered in its frame, a spiderweb of cracks instantly frosting its surface. 3 men filled the doorway, their long dusters failing to conceal the rifles they held with practiced ease. The man in the lead, however, was different. He carried no rifle, only a silver-plated Colt Peacemaker that seemed an extension of his hand. He was tall and lean, with a face that might have been handsome were it not for the cruel amusement glittering in his pale blue eyes. He moved with a languid grace that was more menacing than any brute force. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," the man said, his voice smooth as polished stone, carrying an educated cadence that was jarringly out of place. "Apologies for the intrusion. Please consider this municipal tax, an unscheduled withdrawal for the betterment of our humble enterprise." His 2 men spread out their rifles, leveling on the teller and the bank's only other customer, a rancher who had frozen mid-signature. Colt didn't move. He'd seen death before, smelled it on the wind. This was it. He slowly placed his hat back on his head, the familiar weight a small comfort. His own revolver was holstered tight against his hip, a useless comfort. 3 to 1 were odds for fools and dead men. The leader sauntered past him, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the bank manager's ornate oak desk. He ignored the stacks of currency his men were stuffing into canvas sacks. His attention was fixed on something small, something that glinted in the afternoon light. With a gloved hand, he picked up a silver locket resting on the blotter. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved, with the image of a soaring eagle. Colt's blood went cold. The air thickened in his lungs, turning to ice. The world narrowed to that single point of light in the robber's hand. It was impossible. A phantom limb of memory ached in his chest, a pain so sharp and sudden it almost brought him to his knees. It was his mother's locket, identical in every impossible detail to the one she had worn until the day she died, the one he had clutched in his hand as a boy before his father had taken it for safekeeping. The locket he'd last seen lying in the dust of a dry canyon, lost in the chaotic, bloody ambush that had claimed his posse and shattered his life 8 years ago. A pretty trinket, the leader mused, his thumb tracing the eagle's wings. He turned, and for the first time, his pale eyes met Colt's. There was a flicker of something in their depths, not recognition, but something akin to it. A dark, knowing curiosity. "Does it hold some value for you, friend?" Colt's throat was a knot of sand and ashes. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His hand twitched, a traitorous instinct, urging it toward his gun. The man smiled, a slow, chilling curve of his lips. "I am Silas Blackwood, and I take what has sentimental value. It's so much more personal." He snapped the locket shut and slipped it into his vest pocket, the gesture as casual as if he were pocketing a pocket watch. The act felt like a violation, a desecration of a sacred memory. The robbery was over in minutes. Blackwood and his men backed out of the door, their movements fluid and professional. They left behind a terrified teller, a stunned rancher, and a world that had for Colt Maddox just been torn from its foundations. The plan to buy land to find peace dissolved into dust. That locket wasn't just a piece of silver. It was a key to the massacre that haunted his every waking moment, the event that had turned him into a ghost. And the man who held it, Silas Blackwood, was no longer just a bank robber. He was the end of a trail Colt never knew he was still on. The quest wasn't for justice anymore. It was personal. The sun beat down on the cracked earth of Twin Creek's main street, bleaching the landscape to a bone-white glare. The wind, a constant weary sigh across the plains, tasted of grit and distance. It pushed dust into every crevice, coating the false-fronted buildings with a pale shroud, giving the town the look of a place already surrendering to its own decay. The mountains, jagged like broken teeth against a bruised purple sky, stood indifferent, their stone faces carved by eons of the same relentless wind. Colt Maddox walked through this oppressive stillness, the chaos from the bank having settled into a low, fearful murmur that followed him like a shadow. He wasn't a drifter by choice, but by necessity. After the ambush at Bitter Creek, the one that had left him the sole survivor of a 7-man posse, he'd found that towns felt like cages, and people's questions like prods on a fresh wound. He'd spent 8 years keeping his distance, the memory of his fallen comrades, a constant heavy stone in his gut. He had led them into that canyon. He had been their leader, young and full of his father's fire. And he had failed them. That guilt was the compass by which he navigated his empty life. But now the appearance of the locket had fractured that grim certainty. It was a piece of a past he thought was buried, a past that Silas Blackwood had just unearthed and claimed as his own. Colt's plan to leave Twin Creek was ash. He couldn't. Not until he understood how a dead woman's locket ended up in the hands of a bank robber 100 miles from where it was lost. He found a room above the saloon, a cramped space that smelled of stale whiskey and regret. He dropped his saddlebags on the lumpy mattress and stood at the window, staring down at the street. The world was going about its business. A blacksmith's hammer rang a steady, rhythmic beat. A dog slept in a sliver of shade. Life went on oblivious. His thoughts were a maelstrom, but one image remained fixed, the glint of silver in Blackwood's hand. He felt a desperate need to do something, to act, but he was adrift without a direction. He needed information. He needed to understand the lay of this town, to know who Blackwood was and what held him here. He decided a drink was as good a place to start as any. Downstairs, the saloon was sparsely populated. A few prospectors nursed beers, their faces etched with the same weary hope he saw in every town. The barkeep wiped the counter with a stained rag, his movements slow and methodical. Colt ordered a whiskey and let it burn a clean line down his throat. "Heard there was some trouble at the bank," he said, his voice casual. The barkeep grunted, not looking up. "Silas Blackwood. He comes through now and then, takes what he likes. And the sheriff..." The barkeep gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sheriff Brody. He keeps the peace Blackwood allows him to keep. Calls it pragmatism. The rest of us call it fear." As if summoned, the saloon doors swung open, and the lawman himself entered. Sheriff Brody was a man worn down by the land he was meant to protect. His face was a roadmap of creases, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his tin star. He nodded to the barkeep, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Colt. He walked over his boots, scuffing on the floorboards. "You were in the bank," Brody said. It wasn't a question. "I was," Colt confirmed. "Saw the whole thing, I expect. You get a good look at him. His name is Silas Blackwood." Brody's eyebrows lifted a fraction. He introduced himself. That's his style. Likes the theatrics. You'd be wise to forget his name and his face. He's not a man to cross. He took something Colt said, his voice flat. A silver locket. The sheriff's expression soured. He takes what he wants. Money, trinkets. It's all the same. The less you lose in this town, the luckier you are. My advice, get on your horse and ride on. Twin Creek ain't a place for heroes. The warning was clear, delivered with the exhausted finality of a man who'd seen too many try and fail. But Colt couldn't leave. Not now. The locket was more than a trinket. It was a piece of him. He left the saloon and walked back into the blinding sun, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. The town was suffocating under Blackwood's shadow, and the law was complicit in its own impotence. As he passed the alley between the Mercantile and the sheriff's office, a commotion drew his attention. A small crowd had gathered their faces, a mixture of cruel excitement and morbid curiosity. In the center of the circle, a young native woman was being tied to a wooden hitching post. Her deerskin dress was torn, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with silent tears. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her wrists were bound above her head, her thin frame pulled taut. A burly man, the Mercantile owner, by the look of his apron, held a coiled leather whip. Thieving savage, the man spat. Caught her taking a loaf of bread, a whole loaf. The crowd murmured its agreement. Their righteousness was a palpable, ugly thing. The woman whose name Colt would later learn was Taya stared at the ground, her body trembling, but her chin held high. The sight ignited a cold fire in Colt's belly. It was the same casual cruelty he'd just witnessed in the bank, just smaller, uglier, and aimed at someone who couldn't fight back. He'd spent years riding away from trouble, convincing himself it wasn't his to solve. But Blackwood's appearance had changed something. The world was no longer a place he could just pass through. The theft of the locket had ripped away his apathy, leaving a raw nerve exposed. He saw the Mercantile owner raise the whip, testing its weight, a smirk on his face. He saw the flicker of terror in the young woman's eyes. And in that instant, Colt Maddox made a choice. He wouldn't ride on. He would stay. He would find out what a man like Silas Blackwood was doing in a forgotten town like Twin Creek, and he would get his mother's locket back. But first, there was a different kind of debt to settle right here in the dust of this miserable street. This town, rotting from the inside out, needed a reminder that some lines shouldn't be crossed. Pushing through the crowd, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, he walked toward the post. His fight wasn't just with Silas Blackwood anymore. It was with the whole damn town. The crowd parted for Colt like water around a stone. His face was a mask of cold resolve, his eyes fixed on the man with the whip. The Mercantile owner, a fleshy man named Jebediah Finch, faltered, the whip lowering slightly as Colt stopped a few feet away. "That's enough," Colt said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs of the crowd, carrying the chilling authority of a man who dealt in absolutes. Finch bristled, his face reddening. "This ain't your concern, stranger. She's a thief. She needs to learn a lesson." "She's a half-starved girl who took a loaf of bread," Colt countered, his gaze unwavering. "The lesson's been taught. Let her go." Sheriff Brody himself said she was to be made an example of, someone shouted from the crowd. Colt didn't spare them a glance. His focus remained on Finch. "Is the sheriff here now? I just spoke to him." He seemed more concerned with avoiding trouble than starting it. "Untie her." The finality in his tone left no room for argument. It wasn't a request. Finch hesitated, his eyes darting from Colt's impassive face to the holstered pistol at his hip. He was weighing the satisfaction of the whip against the potential cost. The crowd grew silent, waiting. The tension was a taut wire stretched between the two men. "Some debts don't get paid in coin," Colt said, his voice dropping even lower. "And some don't get paid with a whip. Cut her loose or I'll cut you down." The threat was delivered without heat, a simple statement of fact. Finch swallowed hard, a bead of sweat tracing a line through the grime on his temple. He muttered something under his breath, a curse lost to the wind, and with a final hateful glare at the girl, he threw the whip to the ground. He pulled a knife from his belt and sawed through the ropes binding her wrists. Taya stumbled forward as the ropes fell away, her knees buckling. Colt stepped in and caught her by the elbow, his grip firm and steadying. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He saw a flicker of a deep, resilient spirit beneath the terror. He shrugged off his long trail coat and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, but she clutched it tight, pulling the worn fabric around herself like a shield. "Let's go," he said, his hand gently guiding her back. The crowd watched them, their expressions now sullen and resentful. Colt ignored them, leading Taya away from the center of town, toward the cottonwood grove where he'd left his horse. He didn't look back. They rode in silence, Taya seated in front of him, her body rigid. He could feel her trembling, the tremors of shock and exhaustion running through her. His cabin was a few miles out, nestled in a small defensible valley carved between two stony hills. It was a place he'd found by accident and stayed out of inertia, a temporary shelter that was about to become the center of a storm. Inside the one-room cabin was Spartan, a bunk, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table. He lit the lamp of the golden light, pushing back the encroaching twilight. He set a plate of beans and a cup of water on the table for her, then stepped back, giving her space. She ate with a desperate hunger, her hands shaking. He turned away, busying himself by the hearth, giving her the dignity of not being watched. He could feel her eyes on him, studying him, trying to understand the man who had intervened when no one else would. When she finished, she spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. "They will not forget this." "I'm not planning on letting them," Colt replied, his back still to her. He gestured to a bedroll near the fire. "You can sleep there. You'll be safe." She nodded, curling up on the bedroll, the coat still wrapped tightly around her. She watched him as he sat on the edge of his bunk and began to clean his revolver, his movements slow and methodical, a ritual of deadly calm. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the fire and the whisper of the oiled rag against steel. He was a man comfortable with violence, yet he had used its threat to save her. The contradiction settled in her mind, a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. The next morning she was gone. The bedroll was empty, his coat vanished with her. A grim, familiar loneliness settled back into the cabin. It was for the best, he told himself. He had his own war to fight, and he didn't need anyone caught in the crossfire. But as he saddled his horse, a knot of disappointment tightened in his chest. He was about to ride back to town to start digging into the mystery of Silas Blackwood when he saw her. She was standing by the creek, washing the dirt from her face. She had returned. She wore his coat, but she carried a bundle of firewood, an offering. "I came back," she said, as if it were the most surprising thing in the world. Colt just nodded. "Fire's getting low." Days began to fall into a quiet rhythm, a fragile truce against the world outside. Taya was a silent, efficient presence. She mended his clothes with small, perfect stitches, cooked their meager meals, and kept the cabin with a tidiness it had never known. She spoke little, but she watched everything. Her perceptive gaze missed nothing, from the way he'd unconsciously checked the ridgelines for riders to the tension in his jaw when he thought himself unobserved. Colt began his investigation subtly. He rode into town for supplies, lingering in the saloon, listening to the low-level gossip. He learned that Silas Blackwood and his men had a camp somewhere up in the Cinder Mountains, that they were rumored to be prospecting a hidden silver claim using the robberies to fund their operation. But it didn't add up. Theatrics, the sheriff had called it. A man digging for silver didn't announce his name during a robbery. A man focused on greed didn't steal a locket with no monetary value. One evening, Taya noticed him staring into the fire, his hand clenched into a fist. She spoke in her quiet way, her words often taking the form of observations rather than questions. A man who shouts in the wind only makes himself hoarse, she said, her hands busy mending a tear in his shirt. But a man who listens to it learns the shape of the mountains. Colt looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. What have you heard in the wind? The men in town speak of you, she said. They say you seek a ghost. They speak of Blackwood with fear, but also with a strange respect. They say he is a man of his word. She paused, threading her needle. They also whisper an old name. The Blackwood Massacre. A family of homesteaders killed years ago, near Bitter Creek. Bitter Creek. The name was a punch to the gut. The site of his ambush, the place where his posse had died, the place where the locket had been lost. What else, he asked, his voice tight. Only that the homestead was burned to the ground. There were no survivors. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture he didn't want to see. He had to get closer to Blackwood. He started riding the trails into the Cinder Mountains, not looking for a confrontation, but for information. On his third day out, he found their camp. It was well hidden in a box canyon. From a high ridge, he watched them through his spyglass. He saw Blackwood sitting by a fire reading a book. He was calm, patient. He wasn't acting like a man hiding from the law. He was acting like a man waiting for something. As Colt watched, he saw Blackwood take the locket from his pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it, turning it over and over in his hand, his expression unreadable. It wasn't a prize. It was a reminder, a totem. That night, back at the cabin, Colt was cleaning his rifle when Taya spoke again. That man in the bank, she said, her voice soft. When he looked at you, it was not the look of a stranger. What do you mean? His eyes, she said, her own dark gaze steady on his. They knew you. Like a hawk knows the shape of a rabbit it has hunted for a very long time. The chill that ran down Colt's spine had nothing to do with the night air. Taya was right. He had felt it too, that flicker of dark familiarity. Blackwood wasn't just a random thief who had stumbled upon a piece of his past. He was connected to it. He was hunting Colt. The bank robbery hadn't been about the money. It had been a message, an invitation. A few days later, the invitation was delivered more directly. Colt found a piece of paper pinned to his cabin door with a hunting knife. On it, in elegant script, were 3 words. Bitter Creek, sundown. It was a trap. He knew it. But it was one he had to walk into. This was bigger than a stolen locket now. This was about the truth of what happened that day, 8 years ago, when his world ended. You cannot go, Taya pleaded, her composure finally breaking. He will kill you. He could have killed me in the bank, Colt said, checking the loads in his revolver. He wants something else. He wants answers. So do I. He looked at her, his expression softening for a fraction of a second. Bar the door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone. He rode out as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. He rode toward Bitter Creek, toward the ghosts of his past, and toward a man who held the key to all of it. He was no longer just the hunter. He was also the prey. The ride to Bitter Creek was a journey through a graveyard of memories. Every rock formation, every twisted juniper tree whispered of the day his life had split in two. The air grew cooler as he climbed into the high country, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. He remembered the heat of that day, the oppressive sun and the taste of dust and impending violence. He had been so sure of himself then, leading his posse, his father's son, convinced of the righteousness of their cause. They were tracking a gang of rustlers, or so they'd been told. The trail had led them into this very canyon. He dismounted at the canyon's mouth, the place where the shooting had started. The silence now was profound, broken only by the cry of a lone hawk circling high overhead. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the loose shale, every step an echo of the past. He saw it all again, the muzzle flashes from the ridge, the surprised cries of his men, the chaos, the blood soaking into the thirsty ground. He had survived only because his horse, spooked by the first volley, had thrown him behind a granite boulder. He'd laid there wounded and helpless, listening to his friends die. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the canyon. Silas Blackwood. He stood with the setting sun at his back, a tall silhouette against the dying light. He was alone. "I knew you'd come," Maddox Blackwood called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "A man can't run from his own grave forever." "What do you want?" Blackwood Colt's hand hovered over his gun. "Want?" Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I want to talk about this place, about the day good men died here." He took a step forward, his hands held open away from his pistol. "You call it an ambush? A tragic loss of brave lawmen. That's the story you've been telling yourself, isn't it? We were chasing rustlers. They led us into a trap." "There were no rustlers," Maddox Silas said, his voice turning hard as flint. "There was just my family. My father, my mother, my two younger sisters. We were homesteaders. This was our land." He gestured to the canyon around them. "We weren't rustlers. We were the prey." Colt stared at him, confusion warring with a dawning, sickening horror. "What are you talking about?" "Your posse?" Silas said, his voice trembling with a rage that had simmered for 8 long years. "You didn't ride in here to serve a warrant. You came to erase us. My father had found a rich vein of silver on this land. A vein your father wanted." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. His father respected, honored the man who had taught him everything about law and justice. It was impossible. A liar's desperate tale. "You're lying." Colt breathed the words, tasting like poison. M.I. Silas took another step, his face now visible in the twilight, etched with a grief so profound it was terrifying. "I was 14. I was out checking traps when you rode in. I hid in the rocks up there," he pointed to the ridge, "and I watched. I watched you and your brave men ride down on my home. I heard the screams. I saw the fire." His voice broke. "It wasn't an ambush, Maddox. It was a massacre. Your posse, they weren't the victims. They were the murderers." The world tilted on its axis. The ghosts of Bitter Creek shifted their faces, changing from martyred friends to monstrous executioners. The muzzle flashes, he remembered. They weren't all from the ridge. Some had come from below, from his own men. He'd been so focused on the men he'd lost that he'd never truly questioned the narrative. His guilt had blinded him. "I was the only one who got away." Silas continued, his voice regaining its cold composure. "I am Silas Blackwood, the sole survivor of the Blackwood family. And you, Colt Maddox, you led the men who slaughtered them." He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver locket, holding it up so it caught the last rays of sun. "This was my mother's. I saw you stoop over her body as she lay dying. I saw this fall from her neck as your men dragged her from our burning cabin. You left it behind in your hurry to escape the 1 or 2 shots my father managed to fire before you cut him down. Colt's carefully constructed reality shattered into a million pieces. The weight in his gut wasn't the guilt of a failed leader. It was the rot of a man complicit in an atrocity. He hadn't just lost his men here, he had lost his soul. He looked at Silas Blackwood, no longer seeing a charismatic killer, but a boy forced to watch his world burn, a boy whose ghost had been hunting him for 8 years. Why, Colt whispered the question, a ragged gasp. Why tell me now? Why not just kill me? Because killing you is too easy, Silas sneered, his face a mask of cold fury. Death is a release. I want you to live with it. I want you to know what you did, what your sainted father made you do. I took the locket to get your attention. I robbed the bank to draw you out. I wanted you to come back here to this place and remember it not as your tragedy, but as my own. He holstered his pistol, the gesture a final act of contempt. Your punishment, Maddox, is to live with the truth. Now get off my family's land. Colt stood frozen, the canyon walls pressing in on him. The weight of this new monstrous truth was crushing. He was the villain in his own story. The ambush that had defined his life was a lie, a carefully crafted fiction to cover an unspeakable crime. Silas Blackwood turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Colt alone in the echoing silence of the canyon, a place that was no longer a monument to his failure, but to his unforgivable sin. The ride back to the cabin was a descent into a personal hell. The landscape, once stark and beautiful, now seemed accusatory, its shadows filled with the faces of the dead. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the brush, was a judgment. Colt felt hollowed out, a shell of a man whose foundations had been scoured away by Blackwood's revelation. His father. The name was a curse in his mind. He saw his father's face not as the stern, honorable patriarch he remembered, but as a cold-eyed architect of murder. He stumbled into the cabin, the door groaning on its hinges. Taya was waiting, a rifle held across her lap. She saw his face in the lamplight, and the weapon lowered. The question in her eyes was one she didn't need to ask. He told me, Colt said, his voice rough, broken. He sank onto the bench by the table, his head in his hands. It was all a lie. He told her everything. The words came out in a torrent, a confession held back for 8 years. He spoke of the massacre, of his posse's true role, of his father's greed. He spared himself no detail, laid his shame bare in the quiet intimacy of the cabin. Taya listened without interruption, her dark eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. She did not offer pity or condemnation. When he finished, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. She rose and came to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was not one of comfort, but of grounding. A silent affirmation that he was still here, still breathing, even if the man he thought he was had died back in that canyon. The past is a river that flows through you, she said softly. You cannot dam it, or it will wash you away. You can only learn its currents. Her wisdom, so simple and profound, cut through his despair. For days, Colt wrestled with his demons. He barely ate, slept in fitful, nightmare-ridden bursts. He was paralyzed by the truth. What could he do? His father was long dead. His comrades were buried. Justice was a word that had lost all meaning. Silas Blackwood's revenge to make him live with the knowledge was perfect in its cruelty. Colt felt himself drowning in it. Taya became his anchor. She didn't push him, but her steady presence was a constant, quiet challenge to his surrender. She would place a plate of food before him, mend his clothes, keep the fire burning her actions, a testament to the simple, persistent act of living. She reminded him that the sun still rose, that the world had not ended, even if his had. One afternoon, as a storm gathered over the mountains, she sat across from him. "This man Blackwood," she said. "He lost his family. You lost yours. He walks a path of vengeance. You walk a path of guilt. Both paths lead to the same empty place." "He has a right to his vengeance," Colt said bitterly. "And what about you?" she countered. "Do you have a right to justice, not for your men, for his family? The truth you now carry is a heavy stone. You can let it sink you, or you can use it to build something new." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had been so consumed by his own guilt that he hadn't considered what true justice might look like. It wasn't about punishing the dead. It was about honoring the wronged, clearing the Blackwood name, acknowledging the crime. That was the only path forward that wasn't a dead end. But how? His answer arrived with the storm. The wind rose to a gale, shrieking through the pines, and sand from the plains began to whip against the cabin, a relentless scouring assault. It was a sandstorm, a blinding monster that swallowed the landscape. Just as the storm hit its peak, a lone rider appeared out of the swirling brown haze, heading not for the cabin, but for town. It was one of Blackwood's men. "He's making his move," Colt said, standing and going to the door. The storm was an opportunity, a cloak of chaos. "What will you do?" Taya asked, her face etched with worry. "I'm going to town," Colt said, a new hard resolve in his voice. "This ends tonight, one way or another." He saddled his horse, the wind tearing at him, the sand stinging his eyes. He wrapped a kerchief over his face and rode into the heart of the storm. The world was a maelstrom of roaring wind and flying grit. Visibility was near zero. He navigated by instinct, the horse fighting for every step. He reached Twin Creek to find it transformed into a desolate, howling wasteland. The streets were empty, the buildings shuttered tight against the storm. The only light came from the saloon, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes in the gloom. He knew that's where Blackwood would be. It was the heart of the town, the perfect stage for his final act. Colt pushed open the saloon doors. The wind howled in behind him, sending cards and napkins scattering across the floor. The room was crowded not with prospectors, but with the terrified townsfolk, Sheriff Brody Jebediah Finch, Mr. Abernathy the bank teller, and a dozen others huddled together like frightened sheep. Silas Blackwood stood behind the bar, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, his peacemaker in the other. His two men stood guard at the back door. And beside Silas, held with a firm grip on her arm, was Taya. Colt's heart stopped. She must have followed him. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his resolve. Silas smiled, his teeth a white slash in his sand-dusted face. "Welcome, Maddox. I was hoping you'd join us. The guest of honor has arrived." He tightened his grip on Taya's arm, making her wince. "I found this brave little bird fighting her way through the storm. She said she was worried about you. Such loyalty. A shame you don't deserve it." The sandstorm raged outside, rattling the windows, the building groaning under its assault. The saloon was an island in a sea of chaos, a pressure cooker of fear and unresolved history. The townsfolk stared, their faces pale. Sheriff Brody looked at his own feet, a man defeated. "Let her go," Blackwood Colt said, his voice level despite the frantic pounding of his heart. "This is between you and me." "Oh, everything is between you and me," Silas purred. "But she is the catalyst. She is the leverage. I don't want her. I want a confession. I want you to tell these good people, these pillars of the community, who cower under my shadow, the truth of Bitter Creek." I want you to tell them what kind of man your father was. I want you to say the names of my family aloud. Say them. This was the climax of his revenge. Not just to break Colt, but to shatter his family's legacy in public, to expose the rot at the heart of the town's silent complicity. Colt looked at Taya, at the fear in her eyes, but also at the unwavering strength. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Don't do it for me. But he had to. For her. For himself. My father. Colt began the words like shards of glass in his throat. Was a monster Silas finished for him. A greedy, sanctimonious killer who hid his sins behind a badge and a Bible. But there's a piece you're still missing, isn't there, Maddox? You've accepted the crime, but you haven't truly understood the man behind it. From inside his coat, Silas produced a small, leather-bound journal. He tossed it onto the bar. It slid across the polished wood and stopped in front of Colt. My father's journal. I found it in the wreckage of our cabin. He documented everything, including the correspondence he had with your esteemed patriarch. Silas's eyes glittered with a triumphant, terrible light. He has letters. Letters from your father. Go on. Open it. With a shaking hand, Colt opened the journal. Tucked inside was a folded piece of paper, the ink faded, but the handwriting unmistakable. It was his father's hand. He read the words, and the final terrible piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His father hadn't just ordered the massacre for the silver. The letter spoke of cleansing the land of the Blackwoods' refusal to sell of their ungodly ways. It was more than greed. It was a fanatical, cold-blooded crusade. The final line burned itself into his mind. Leave no one alive. Erase the name. My son will lead. He is loyal. He will not question. He wasn't just a participant. He was the chosen instrument. His loyalty, his love for his father, had been the weapon used to slaughter an innocent family. The betrayal was absolute, a poison that annihilated the last vestiges of his past. He looked up, his eyes meeting Silas's. He saw no triumph there now, only a shared, bottomless ocean of grief. Now you know, Silas whispered. The saloon door suddenly burst inward, torn from its hinges by a gust of wind, and the storm flooded the room. Lanterns swung wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows. In the chaos, one of Blackwood's men, unnerved, raised his rifle. Colt reacted on pure instinct. He drew, fired, the man fell. The sound of the shot was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Silas shoved Taya behind the bar and brought his own gun up. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sand, splintering wood, and gunfire. Colt dove behind an overturned card table as a bullet tore through the space where he'd been standing. He fired back, not aiming to kill, but to suppress. He had to get to Taya. Through the swirling chaos, he saw Silas dragging Taya toward the back door. Colt scrambled to his feet, ignoring the townsfolk screaming and cowering on the floor. He charged forward, tackling the second guard and sending them both crashing into the bar. He brought the barrel of his pistol down on the man's head, and he went limp. Now it was just him and Silas. In the howling dark of the saloon, lit only by a single wildly swinging lantern, the two men faced each other. Silas held Taya in front of him, the muzzle of his peacemaker pressed to her temple. It ends now, Maddox, Silas screamed over the wind. One way or another, the debt is paid. The debt is mine. Blackwood, not hers, Colt yelled back. His own gun leveled his heart, hammering against his ribs. It was my father. My name, let her go, and you can have me. For a long moment they were frozen in a deadly tableau. The storm raged around them, a physical manifestation of the turmoil in their souls. Taja looked at Colt, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a message, an idea. Her gaze flickered down to the bar, to the heavy whiskey bottles lining the shelf behind Silas. Understanding dawned. It was a fool's chance. He had one shot left. Silas was waiting for him to lower his gun to surrender. Colt slowly, deliberately began to lower his pistol. Silas's eyes followed the movement, a flicker of triumph on his face. But Colt's aim didn't drop to the floor. It shifted a foot to the left. He fired. The bullet missed Silas by inches, shattering the large mirror behind the bar and 2 full bottles of whiskey. The alcohol sprayed everywhere, dousing Silas and the wooden bar. The swinging lantern, its glass already cracked, chose that moment to fall. It crashed onto the liquor-soaked bar, and the world erupted in a sheet of blue and orange flame. Silas screamed, batting at the fire that licked at his coat, his grip on Taya loosening for a critical second. It was all she needed. She drove her elbow back into his ribs and broke free, scrambling away from the flames. Colt was already moving, pulling her behind him as the fire roared to life, consuming the back wall of the saloon. Silas, his face a mask of rage and pain, turned, raising his pistol through the flames. But Colt was faster. He fired his last shot not at Silas's heart, but at his gun hand. The peacemaker flew from his grasp. Silas staggered back, clutching his shattered wrist, his retreat cut off by the wall of fire. He looked at Colt, his face illuminated by the inferno that was consuming his revenge. In his eyes, Colt saw not hatred, but a final hollow emptiness. The fire surged, and the roof timbers groaned. The whole building was going to come down. "Come on," Colt yelled, grabbing Taya's hand and pulling her toward the front door, away from the collapsing saloon, and the man trapped inside, a ghost finally consumed by the ghosts he had chased. They stumbled out into the raging storm and the heat of the fire at their backs, the sand and wind, a merciless cleansing force. The storm broke with the dawn. It left behind a world scoured clean, the sky a fragile pale blue. The Twin Creek Saloon was a smoking ruin, a blackened skeleton against the morning light. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters, blinking in the sudden brightness, their faces drawn and somber. They gathered in the street, staring at the wreckage, at Colt and Taya, who stood watching the last of the smoke curl into the still air. Sheriff Brody approached them, his face haggard. "Blackwood." "He's gone," Colt said. The words held no triumph. The fire had claimed Silas, and with him the last echo of a feud that had consumed 2 families. Colt knew what he had to do. He walked to the center of the street, to the stunned and silent crowd. He held up his father's letter, its edges singed from the fire. His voice, clear and steady, carried in the morning quiet. "Silas Blackwood wasn't just a thief," he began. "He was the victim of a crime this town has been silent about for 8 years. He told them everything. He read his father's letter aloud, the words, an indictment that fell like stones into the silence. He spoke the names of the murdered Blackwood family, Elijah, Sarah, Rebecca, and Martha. He cleared their name, and in doing so, irrevocably tarnished his own. He watched the truth land in their eyes, saw the flicker of old buried knowledge in some, the shock and dawning shame in others. He was no longer Colt Maddox, son of a respected lawman. He was the son of a murderer. When he was done, a heavy silence hung over the street. He then walked to the bank, to a stunned Mr. Abernathy, and withdrew his entire inheritance. He gave a portion to the teller to cover the bank's losses from the robbery. He gave another to Jebediah Finch to pay for the rebuilding of the saloon. The rest he gave to Sheriff Brody. "For the town," he said, "for a proper burial for the Blackwood family, if their remains can be found, and to mark their graves." He had nothing left. No money, no legacy, no name he could bear to carry. All he had was the woman standing beside him. He and Taya walked out to the small windswept cemetery on the edge of town. They found a quiet, unmarked patch of ground. Colt took the silver locket from his pocket. He'd retrieved it from Blackwood's vest in the final moments before the fire took hold. He dug a small hole in the hard-packed earth with his hands. He held the locket for a long moment, its silver warm from his touch. It was a symbol of love, of loss, of a history poisoned by greed and lies. He placed it in the hole and covered it with dirt, burying the feud, burying his father's sins and his own ghosts with it. He was finally free of the past. They walked back to the cabin, the rising sun warming their faces. The world felt new, uncertain, but clean. He had no plan, no destination. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't running from something. As they reached the small valley, he saw Taya was carrying a piece of smooth, weathered pine and his carving knife. She had been working on it secretly for days. "I thought the cabin needed a sign," she said, a small, hopeful smile on her face. She held it up for him to see. There were 2 words expertly carved into the wood. It did not say Maddox. It said Redemption Creek. It wasn't a name, but a promise. A new beginning built not on a legacy of lies, but on a foundation of hard-won truth. Colt looked at the sign and then at Taya, her dark eyes shining with a future he never thought he would have. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He wasn't riding off into the sunset. He was staying. He was home.